Hi, everyone, and welcome to podcast number 22 for the Theorycrafting Roundtable. I'm your host, Artesians. I'm the head of Theorycrafting from Kaching Mains, and I'm joined again by my co-hosts, KB Fan and Zadger77. If y'all want to say hi or give a quick introduction again.
Yeah,
Hey,
or
guys.
you're not convincing them this is the same podcast as it used to be. This is not podcast 22. This is like podcast 2.
True. So, and to start off real quick, we did change our format for the people that are joining us in, and last week we actually talked about Furina and her impact on the meta. I looked through the comments and we got some interesting things said, and I just wanted to start off maybe every podcast with a quickie on our thoughts. One of the common questions we got was, we've had a little more time with Furina, and has anything changed in like the last 2 weeks?
I don't remember what I ate for breakfast. How am I supposed to remember what I said last week?
That's perfect.
I don't think my sentiment on her changed much. I mean, eventually I'm gonna just get C2 pilled over the time and just think that she's better than what she is, right? But it's just it is what it is, right? When you play the character at like C2 with yoked out artifacts, you're gonna think that they're stronger at C0 eventually.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
yeah, I mean, I think she's still good, right? But then again, there are some people in the comments who thought that I wasn't too positive about her, but I mean, I don't know how else to say it. She's good, right? I really enjoy using her.
Just say
in
the
a lot of my
words.
teams.
Just say the words,
Yeah?
KB. Must
What?
pull.
Must pull the forbidden TCR word.
Okay. For me personally, I had the chance to run some preliminary sims on her, and it turns out that if you're using like the right healer for the right team, like a synergistic healer, she's like an upgrade in almost every single slot. Otherwise, she's like at least even. So there's that.
Yeah.
A common sentiment that we also hear is that Furina has been uplifting a lot of characters, as well as making specialized healers much more viable. Any disagreements there?
Nah, I think she just brings a lot of characters up that are not as good, especially Noelle compared to Ito. I know a lot of the Ito players are in shambles right now that this random 4-star Noelle is just outperforming him now.
But you want to know the real winners? The real characters that have been brought up by Furina?
Who?
Bennett, Shangling.
This
no.
guy.
Okay, listen.
No,
I was
no.
actually I was told that I should try Bennett channeling Kokomi Furina.
Yes.
I was like, it's probably gonna be alright. And then I tried it, and it actually surprised me that it's like how good the team is.
Yeah.
Yes.
Terrapin has been harping on this team, and I haven't had the chance to sim it yet. But
Yeah,
it's
he's the one
pretty
who
crazy. It's pretty crazy. I tried it out a while ago.
Tara DM'd me, and I was like, yeah, sure. And then I tried it, and it is actually quite good. I think, I mean, any channeling team where you don't have grouping will have its limitations in certain pieces of content, but as far as animal-less channeling teams go, it's definitely up there as one of the strongest ones.
For sure.
Yeah. It's also much easier to play than some of the other weird jangling teams, right?
All right.
Yeah.
So, to get on forward, we were originally going to do something about Geo or Navia, but we decided that it'd probably be more interesting to do that after we get our hands on her in 4.3. And on Twitter, I put out a small poll asking whether y'all would prefer to discuss Noviette or Meta and Powercreep. And with 69% of the vote, today's topic is Meta and Powercreep. So let's start off real quick with the definition of meta. It's commonly known as, in the gaming community, as an acronym for most effective tactics available. And it's basically a generally agreed upon strategy by any given community.
SMH my head.
And
bad information. Art out here spreading misinformation.
So, and there's a lot of different definitions of what meta is and what it means to different people. And I think it's good to start out with everyone, laying out the foundation from which they're arguing or giving their opinion on.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Apparently, and I also used to think that it stood for most effective tactic available, but apparently it just originated as like, you know, meta whatever just means like the study of the thing itself, right? So meta like gameplay is just gameplay that's like the study of the gameplay to optimize it or whatever, right?
Yeah.
It's and
In reference to itself, yeah.
yeah, and it was apparently retroactively said to mean most effective tactic available. But I mean, either way, right? It's
Either way,
describing
yeah.
the same idea of just
Generally,
what's the best thing.
What's the best thing in a game? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
for Genshin, it's actually quite interesting, right? There's a lot of
Yeah.
factors that go into evaluating meta. So anyone want to start off with what they might think?
Yeah. Genshin's biggest issue when it comes to that is effectively that there is no objective goal, in the sense that there is technically a goal that like people can strive for that's like given to you by the game, which is the 36-star abyss. But it's so easy to reach that goal with proper like knowledge of how to build your characters and how to play teams, right? People have been in the right abysses, right? The ones that are a little bit easier have been doing like from new account to 36-star in like a week, right? And so it leaves you in this place where for anyone who plays the game somewhat seriously, who's been playing for a little bit, you have or it's pretty likely that you've had the opportunity to reach that goal already, and what now? And because that goal is so like not that difficult to reach, it creates a situation where there's no one objective goal, and you kind of have to decide what your goal is going to be. Do you want to clear even faster than that? Do you want to play a bunch of different teams? Do you want to try to make it so that your favorite bad character can 36-star? And that leads to a meta effectively being very subjective to some extent, where depending on the criteria you use, you'll have different results when it comes to what the meta is.
Absolutely. I actually recently wrote out my thoughts, or with KB, we wrote out our thoughts on like what meta kind of means in Genshin. And we kind of boil it down to a character's performance, their ease of use, and like their cost of investment. And generally speaking, like people weigh these three factors differently, but most of the things that you think of for a character when we're thinking about how good they are kind of fall in these three categories. And meta itself in Genshin, like you said, is so subjective because there really isn't a clear goal at the end of the day. 36-star Abyss is quite honestly all we really have that's consistently there. And for serious players, I agree that it's very easy to get to the 36-star, but to advocate for people that don't play the game as seriously, like recently I had a conversation with someone who asked how to 36-star the Abyss, and it wasn't that their characters were bad or their teams were bad. They just didn't know how like enemy AI worked. So
Damn, bro's out here saying they suck at the game. All right.
So
I see.
like there was nothing for me to tell him in terms of artifacts or like weapons or like characters, what people normally think of, like what you need to know to be quote good at the game, right? What about you, KB?
Oh man, I have like a long lore on meta. So my background, like ever since I was very young, I played a lot of StarCraft, right? StarCraft Brood War, StarCraft 2, And eventually, we all degenerate to playing League of Legends, right? And those games have a pretty different like take on what meta really means, right? At least in those games, they're usually competitive games where you're playing against someone else, and the idea is you have a clear objective to win, right? And for the most part, in those kinds of games, I would consider meta to be very strong strategies that are easily replicable for that skill level, right? So the definition for meta will change depending on skill bracket, right? As you can see in like Worlds, right? Certain characters are really good, but then if you let the average person play them, they're dog shit at playing it, right? So the meta is different depending on the environment you're in.
If you want a good example of that, you can head to the Rise mains subreddit at literally any time in the past 5 years.
Right. So yeah, in Genshin, it's a bit different, right? The game is, I would say, easier to execute in general, but also the demands required of the player are also much lower, right? So the question is, some people do still keep the stricter definition of meta, as in like these are only the best teams can qualify as meta or whatnot. Or some people may have a looser definition, like these are teams that will do well enough for you to get to where you want to be, and they're easier to execute. And it just depends on the player, right? Like if they value ease of execution or low investment or speed of clearing, right? We all have different like preferences of what you consider meta, right? For example, I generally like fast replicable clears on most characters. I think I rate those highly over a little bit more than ease of use sometimes. That's just my preferences. I know some people will prefer easier clears, right? That's why like sometimes you'll have like the non-TC people criticize TC about characters like Zhongli, who are like, well, this character absolutely helps me play my game in a more comfortable way, and the quality of life is so much more significant than clearing fast, right? And that's usually like where the discourse comes in, is like people's prioritization of values of things.
Even with that, like you still have the issue that even if you have two people that prioritize the same thing, wish for the same things, like wish on the same banners, the same amount of pulls, one of them's gonna get C660, the other one's gonna get C6 Dory. Like,
Oh yeah, this game
and
also
that
has
introduces the gacha system introduces an additional layer to
Absolutely.
the meta, which is, well, what do you have available to you? Not everyone, like it's not an equal playing field. People have different things on different accounts.
That
that's
actually
another thing
segues
that
us
Genshin has.
perfectly into the next topic. So like there are plenty of people who pool for a million reasons, right? Cuteness, coolness, are they good? Are they bad? What did Zajev
Do
say
people
about
pull for
them,
characters
right?
because they're bad?
Some people do. Spite pulling, yeah. There's like an infinite amount of reasons. That's the point. But how important is it these days to consider the meta? Like what kind of considerations do we have in it these days? Because if we, scroll back time, Diluc and Klee at the very top of the meta, right? You remember old tier lists where Chi-Chi's in the S tier for healing, And what do we have to say about like why it's happened, or like maybe like how important is it anymore, right? For example, my thoughts on the matter is that in the past, the reason why it might have been so different is not just because we didn't know or like we were dumb or something. Well, part of it is that, but maybe more importantly is that the game is ultimately limited resources, right? You have very distinct like decisions that you have to make on the banner and like what to do with your resin. So in that regard, it is important to consider the meta if you're trying to push the abyss at like an early stage of your account. But I think as time goes on, like your priorities change, and maybe you don't care too much about the meta, but you think about other things like speed, comfort, and stuff like that.
I mean, I'd argue that speed and comfort are elements of the meta.
Yeah, I mean, like those factors like that I mentioned earlier, performance, ease of use, and cost. Like, I did not really value ease of use back when Hu Tao came out. My account was pretty bad comparatively to now, and her ability to, dish out more damage the more skilled you got at her meant that I could skip out on like a lot of investment in her cost, at the cost of ease of use for high performance. So these like shifting like levels as you go on, right? A perfect example is how we look at Zhongli and Kokomi.
I mean, I don't know if that's fair because both of those characters got buffed post-release. One of them a lot more than the other. Like the
True.
Clam is very good for Kokomi, but it's like she'd still be pretty good without it. But Zhongli without the buff would be horrible. Like just straight
that's
up
fair.
horrible.
Yeah. But I mean, I do remember post buff Zhongli, he wasn't exactly the most popular, at least in some spheres of TC, right? That it was very explicitly noted that if you use Zhongli, yes, you get the comfort, but it will come at the cost of damage, because that's just how it was back then. Everyone's account was kind of dookie, and it's kind of hard to push the Abyss without, your fourth character doing something else other than shielding.
Yeah. There was also less characters that needed a shield in particular, you'd say. Like,
I mean,
who are the characters? It was like Zhao, right? Who needed a shield.
Yeah, even then.
Yeah.
And there's also just the fact that, like, when you look at like the characters that are to this day very strong, which of them were from 1.0, you notice that it's like it's the 4 stars, it's not the 5 stars. Some of the 5 stars got slightly better as time went on with new things that work with them, like Jean with Furina, or Kuting with Dendro in general, but if you look at like the sort of teams that you could do in 1.0 with the 5 stars versus with the 4 stars, the ones with 4 stars are a lot better. And part of that is because in 1.0, people didn't have constellations on their 4 star. But now, if they've been playing since 1.0, they do. And it's like...
No, I got you. Like, it's how much should a person evaluate like a 4 star, especially for like what kind of advice could you give for someone that's playing since 1.0 but took like a year break? Maybe they don't have the constellations, and these types of considerations change so much between accounts, right? Like, do you consider having C6 Farazan a reasonable thing to assume these days?
No, I don't.
Yeah.
I don't think it's reasonable, but I think it is an important character. That's
it's
the thing.
A reasonable, like, it's not unreasonable to assume that someone will have it, but it is unreasonable to assume that everyone will have it.
Yep.
Yeah.
So this leads me to the last part of meta. So typically when we talk about endgame, we're talking about only the Spiral Abyss and only floor 12. And very rarely, very, very rarely do we ever get combat events like Hypostatic Symphony from eons ago, or Legend of the Vagabond Sword, also a long time ago. Do you think that the community engages with meta in a healthy way, knowing like our endgame choices are so limited?
I mean, I don't know if that's the right question. I feel like there's no good way to engage with the meta because Hoyo does not give us the sort of content that is actually pleasant to do. A lot, like, sometimes they do. Some events are fun, and they're there for like 2 weeks, and then they're gone, and you have nothing for the next 6 months.
Yeah, how it feels for me is I'm prepping for events that'll come every couple fucking months. It's awful, but when you do get the events, they're like fun for me, right? Because I've been prepping for it. It's like, oh, my characters have yoked out stuff. Now I can finally see if I die or not to this event.
Yeah.
Sure. How the community engages with the meta. It's hard to say, you know. Um, in terms of like why people talk about the meta so much in Genshin, I think a lot of people are pretty attached to their pools and like what they decide to spend their primo gems on, and it often gets to the point where like people kind of get really defensive when someone says something like, "Oh, so and so is not that great," or is a straight trash unit, but maybe they're particularly attached to them, you know, and it doesn't, or maybe one of the reasons why, other than like them liking it, is that there is an element of investment, right? That for probably a majority of the characters in the game, if you push them hard enough, like um, they will be usable at least, or they have their teammates that can carry them or something like that.
Yeah.
And yeah, in that respect, like it can get healthy and unhealthy. Like I would just say, even as someone who's been engrossed in these conversations for so long, don't get too attached to it. Like it changes so much, and it doesn't really matter that much, right? Like we just said, these combat events are so far in between, and it's just the spiral abyss, right? It's 50 primos per per breakpoint.
I feel like I'm gonna like flame the Genshin community if I talk about this, because I really do not like how, like a generalized sense, like how Genshin handles like topics like character performance compared to other game communities like StarCraft, League of Legends. Usually in those games, or Smash, right, or any competitive game, usually in those games, people who main or play a character a lot or a faction will always say that it's weak, right? But in Genshin, it's the opposite, because you're investing into something, and usually people kind of like have this like tribal kind of community feel for their favorite characters, right? It's like a fan club. And I hate that stuff so much, because it like really like ruins like if you don't care about like what is strong or weak or whatever, and you just like the character, that's fine, right? Like I get characters that aren't good. I play characters that aren't good. I'm pretty sure Zijef plays Dea, which is, come on, right? But like these people will
What are you
just
trying to
jump
say?
in. Yeah.
What
Yeah.
are you trying
These
to
people,
say, huh?
yeah.
What are you saying about my favorite character, KB?
Oh no, I gotta
Let's
say
talk
that they're
about
all
your
right.
favorite character, KB.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
E word.
Yeah, I play Eula. Yeah.
Oh,
But yeah, like fans of these characters will jump at like people who are trying to appraise units, right? And it just really muddies the water when at the end of the day their main push is like they like the character because they think it's cute, or they're attached to the story and all that. Like, don't get me wrong, I like certain characters more than others from a story perspective, right? But I dislike when that stuff gets in the way of like TC topics and like unit analysis and trying to figure out like how to really appraise like how strong certain archetypes are, right? And that happens so much in Genshin. And like other games, I feel like it doesn't happen as much. Like no one gets attached to their units in StarCraft. Like League, to a degree, mains will get attached to their units, right? And they'll say that they're weaker, so in hopes that they get buffed. But in Genshin, nothing gets buffed directly, right? So people don't have as big of an incentive to say that their character is weak, right? In hopes that the devs fix it. So it's just a completely different dynamic. But I can say that I don't really like it. But it is what it is, right? I get it, right? People like their characters. It's understandable. It's completely normal, right?
I think it's actually quite interesting in Genshin that people do have these arguments like all the time. Like, I'll play League of Legends. I don't see like Soraka mains screaming at like, or Sona mains screaming at like Seraphine mains all the time. They're just kind of doing their own thing. Um, when I play
I mean, Sona
Arknights
can't
or
speak. Of course, they're not screaming. What? True.
Drew, um, when I play other games like Arknights or Azur Lane, like a long time ago, I wasn't too involved with the theory crafting site, but I think most people kind of understood yeah, there are characters that are probably better in more scenarios, but that doesn't stop you from using the most dog shit character because you like them. But I think people understood, or most people can understand that. But now that I'm thinking about it, I know Arknights did have a lot of fights over this. So maybe that's not the best example.
I mean, I blame MiHoYo for designing the game
You
this
know,
way.
you
They
know,
they
True.
yeah. They give you no resources, and then when you spend it and you finally get what you want, you still have to spend like 3 days collecting these random like materials on the ground, thinking about this character. Like, of course, people are gonna get attached to the characters because, like, imagine like you spend like all this time like figuring out how to get this character, all this time getting on their materials, spending your limited resources that they squeeze, right? Because you don't get many primo gems.
yeah,
And
you do
then
all of that for
some
Daya, and then
jackass on the internet's like, yeah, this character's not that good, right? And of course, people are going to be mad about that, right?
yeah,
If
but
this
yeah,
was a game where
actually,
everyone was free, it would be totally different.
it would, yeah. It actually, I was talking about something earlier today on stream, and I think it actually surprised a lot of people because I was talking about like what I think about certain characters' personality,
Mm-hmm.
and I have uttered the forbidden words that Singto and Sucrose are actually kind of cringe, actually, and I don't think they're all that likable. And it surprised a lot of people because I keep talking about how good they are and how much you should give them a shot if you're not aware of that. Um, but like it's really just like some characters are just good and it just be like that and it has nothing to do with their personality.
Yeah.
I caught
Yeah.
a little bit of the Zhongli part. That was pretty funny. At least for me, I kind of relate with that because I hate Kokomi so much. Her part of the Archon quest actually killed
Oh
so
boy.
much of my enjoyment for the game. It was unreal. But
What do you mean? She's so smart and tactical.
I agree.
Kokomi shouldn't take the blame for that. She was just the feather that broke the camel's back because the dating simulator right before then was not also very enjoyable for me. Okay, but moving on. Power creep, right, is
Oh, the
something
P
that
word.
is intrinsically related with meta, especially for games that go on for quite a while. And it's a term like meta that usually has multiple meanings, but it kind of describes a phenomenon where new content makes older content irrelevant by a million different metrics. But the way people look at it, just like how people define meta, make it really hard to talk about. So, like we started with meta, definitions and thoughts on power creep and Genshin Impact.
Yeah, I mean, power creep I think is a lot harder to define than meta. Not that like it's harder to find the words for it, but it's harder to get people to agree on a definition
Absolutely.
because the word power creep it has a certain negative connotation, right? If things get better and it's good, then you wouldn't call that power creep. You'd call that power ups. It's creep. It's creeping on you. It's a bad thing, right? And I mean specifically like in Genshin, the things that are stronger, the things that power up, they don't they very very rarely tend to have this effect of actually invalidating old things.
Mm-hmm.
I think up until like what is it, 2 months ago, a month ago, I don't know, 2 months ago, I think I would have said that I don't think there is a single real instance of power creep actually invalidating old things. I think now you could make an argument for Neuvillette invalidating Ayato in a lot of situations. I think
Sorry.
there's still I think there's
That was
still
funny. Sorry.
there's still one team where I think Ayato has a place where he can be stronger than Neuvillette, and that's like if you have the what's it called? The EM gotcha sword that gives you ER.
Zyphos?
Yeah, Zyphos. If you have Zyphos in Nilo teams, the way that he has very large AoE, I've found him to be one of the best performing units in that team, and I think I still like him more than Neuvillette, but like Neuvillette is still pretty good in the slot, so even then, I think that's probably the closest we got. But like outside of that example, I feel like every time we get something where like it can be considered like a stronger version of something else, there's enough caveats to that like the old thing still sees play.
That's fair. Yeah. I think I mostly agree that when we talk about power creep, it's hard. But one of the things, maybe like the best example I can think of is like in old school RuneScape right now, you have the Shadow of Tumekin, and like that thing literally just destroys everything else. And in other examples, like the Fang of Seldor, there's literally no reason to use that over, or the Blade of Seldor, there's no reason to use it like over the Fang because it just costs so much.
They're nerfing Fang.
So yeah. So to relate it back to Genshin, it's like there's like you can use like Ganyu, for example. It's just, and she's not bad. She's not unable to clear the abyss. She's probably above average. It's just the cost of playing her is probably more than a lot of people want to pay. Not just like in like weapons or constellations. It's just like how difficult it is and what types of characters you can play her with and what kind of like places you can play her with. And in that sense, I do think that there is quite a bit of power creep. That for a lot of people, ease of use is one of the things that comes up when power creep comes to mind. Like a lot of people would say that Kazuha was very, very close, or was very, very close to power creeping Sucrose. Not that I agree, but like that's the general sentiment. Kami.
Okay. I think in general, I've always seen like the big 1.0 4-star characters as like kind of where characters should cap out at in terms of like C0 for 5 stars and whatnot. And I think so far they kind of stayed in a good spot, right? There's some archetypes that just kind of do really well right now, as we know, like Hyper Bloom or whatnot. But I think characters themselves are generally, they don't go past that by much, right? Like you don't really see characters surpassing Bennett, Singcho, Sucrose by that much when they're released, and I think that's a good thing, right? Makes the game makes it to where you can access very strong teams with no Primogem investment, right? Comparatively, which is good, right? But I do think they have like really power crept like the dolphin level constellation stuff. If you look back to how constellations used to be in Genshin, right? Like Venti C2, right? Anyone here know what that does? 12% fizz shred when they're in the air. Right? You got scammed if you bought any of those. Like if you spent money for that, you got scammed.
I know of a character that can deal physical damage to enemies that are up in the air.
No way.
Oh my god. But like, yeah, like stuff, even like not just the C2 level, some of the C6s, right? Were just bad.
Venti C6 too.
Yeah. And like nowadays they kind of got in the swing like, oh, if people are getting C2, they better get something that actually does something, because you know, like people are now able to calculate and sim the DPS differences, right? There are some characters where getting the C2 is like 10% improvement in team DPS, right? Or like 5, depending on their responsibility in the team. Some characters are more important in the team DPS output than others. And then there's characters like Nahida C2, right? Where it's like, oh, it's the equivalent of giving everyone their signature weapon in terms of uplift, which is insane, right? So I think they've been doing a good job at the C0 5-star bracket for like not making any characters too egregious, right? You can argue Nouvellette is kind of egregious, but it'll happen, right? It's not like any if you make enough characters, eventually you'll accidentally make one too strong, right?
I don't know if it's on accident.
Who knows? Who knows? Yeah, I don't know. But I definitely know that they've been making the C2s way too strong, like comparative to the 1.0.
Absolutely. I did the Sims for Furina, and it is literally in like all of the teams where Furina is actually doing things, like it is almost a 50% increase in the total team damage.
Oh, it's her personal damage. Yeah. 50% increase for personal. Yeah.
No, but it's for some teams it literally is 50% increase across the total team damage.
Oh, that's like, oh, okay. If she has like a huge responsibility and damage output. Yeah.
Well, the damage bonus, like just ramping up immediately, is a factor. Right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can see that. But yeah, I think now, like looking at all the constellations they've been doing, I do prefer how strong they are now because like someone's gonna pay for that. At least make them strong, right? Instead of just scamming people for like 5%.
I'll hide them C6.
Yeah. Oh man, that could have been way worse too, which is funny. But yeah, like the game has shifted in that bracket of play, and that's why I see some people saying like, yeah, the new characters are good, right? But they're doing it in the context that they're the people who would get a C1 or C2 and just blow out everyone because some of those constellations are just heinous, right? Doesn't mean you have to get them, right? Because like this game is really easy. like does it really matter? Probably not, but they have been doing things a little bit differently over the years.
I want to go back to what Zajef said earlier, that a lot of people have pretty negative connotations when it comes to power creep. But it is the case that sometimes like your gameplay experience improves by quite a bit. And maybe you guys just don't think the same way, or maybe it doesn't occur to you, but Dendro, Nahida, and Furina, like Hyperbloom, one of the things that we always say about them is how much they uplifted a ton of characters with them. And they blew out holes like everywhere across the board. While the ceiling increased, you know, the floor for a lot of characters also increased. Do you guys feel that it's a bad thing? Is there like a line somewhere that you don't want to cross? Or maybe like, what are your thoughts? You know, some people say that Hyperbloom on every character is like a major cop-out, but personally I kind of disagree. If you're gonna use Furina and like Hyperbloom or whatever to power up like your favorite character Xinyan, go for it, buddy. I'm not gonna stop you.
I think it's a good thing that the floor has raised more than the ceilings has. It's kind of hard to actually raise the floor without making the ceiling higher by much as well, right? Like, imagine being the person in charge of the Hydro Archon, right? And you're like, we got to make a character that's good, but we can't make like Nouvellette too good, right?
You know, one of the interesting things about Furina is that she doesn't actually push Utao up that much.
Yeah.
One of the more interesting.
I have been a Hutao Vivi Vape believer.
Oh yeah.
I see the use case for Furina and Hutao teams, but I still don't like them as much as the Vivi Vape ones.
Yeah, I think we're just missing a little bit of something that really can make it work. It's just there's just not really that many team slots that can really fill in that gap that you really need. And, you know, like we said earlier, there's a cost typically to these things. Maybe not so much for Hyperplume, but you know what? We'll take those. We'll take those wins sometimes. So yeah, do you guys have any final thoughts on Meta and Powercreep now that we've kind of hashed it out a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one worst thing to have come out of Dendro raising the floor for so many units is that I think it's made a lot of the theory crafting for new units so much more boring.
Mm-hmm.
Like I
yeah.
miss when if a character wasn't all that great, you had to actually think to figure out what their best team would be. Now, if they're not all that great, you've got a solution, and I don't know. I think it makes it a lot more boring.
I think that's also the negativity that some TCRs have is attributed to that. It's like, yeah, it's like it's not fun to look at Fremine and like, oh, he's probably his best team might be Hyperfringe.
I mean, Eula's
because
was
like they just
Hyperplume for a
made his
while,
numbers.
too.
Yeah, they just fucked up his numbers, so now he's in jail with Hyperfringe, and yeah, that is more boring, I will say. But the trade-off is, I guess, is the game costs less to clear, which I think overall it's okay.
I don't know if it does, because like if you compare it to 1.0, Abyss HP is a tiny little bit higher.
Yeah.
I think it's almost doubled now.
It's way more than doubled.
Yeah,
it's way more than doubled since 1.0. I
mean,
think
there's more
that
waves, so it's not. You can't just look at the HP, right? It's just
yeah.
you need
I think
more
that
time.
the jump in difficulty since pre-Dendro has more or less kept up with the jump in floor for a lot of teams, to the point where it hasn't actually really made the game easier in any way.
I see.
Okay. I think for my opinion is that generally speaking, bar like any crazy abyss floors, I'm talking like multi-wave, and then at the end you have like the gravity boss or something, like barring that stuff, most of the time you can squeeze in like your less than optimal characters in and kind of do whatever you want with proper investment, right? And that's kind of like KQM's mission or whatever, like teach people how to play the characters that they want to play or whatever. But there's no denying, of course, that like that, you know, sometimes the solution is kind of obvious for a lot of characters, right? Like we took one look at Fremine and we were just like, wow, this is yikers. I don't know if there's anything we can do there. But and that is sad, you know. But on the flip side, like I can see the other side too. Like Risley's and like Zajeff is really well known for things like Risley and like Razor TC, right? Where like out of the box solutions where like you have to think about the gauge, you have to think about like what these characters can do with like essentially you're solving a puzzle, and certainly that's more interesting than just okay, buckle up guys, pull out your Nahida and your Raiden and your favorite out of Xingqiu or Yalan, go. So yeah, I can see both sides. All right, guys, we are at 44 minutes. We've hit our target time. Right. We've covered what we wanted to talk about. Any closing thoughts?
I'm tired. I'm going to bed.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us for number 22. We will probably see you again after Navia, where we'll try to talk about Geo and her. But thank you for joining us. Thank you, Zajeff. Thank you, KB. Thank you, everyone in chat. this is going on YouTube as normal. And next time, if you want to catch us, keep an eye out on our socials and stuff like that. Join our Discords. We usually send out pings. And then finally, we do have a Q&A section typically at the end of these, so you have to catch those live. We typically don't record them. But thank you for joining us, guys, and see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Later.